The first written account of diabetes is from an Egyptian script dating back to 1550 BCE, describing a too-great emptying of the urine.
Ancient Indian texts from 600 BCE characterized diabetes with symptoms like excess urine production and sweet or honey-like urine that attracted ants.
400 years later, Aretaeus of Cappadocia, a celebrated Greek physician, is credited with naming diabetes around 200 CE for the Greek word for siphon, because he thought people with the disease passed water like a siphon.
It wasn't until 1889 that Oskar Minkowski and Joseph von Mering from Germany determined that the pancreas was the relevant organ. They found that the removal of the pancreas resulted in diabetic symptoms in dogs.
In 1869, Paul Langerhans referred to islands of clear cells that stain differently from the exocrine tissue of the pancreas. These were later named islets of Langerhans by Edward Laguesse, who also suggested in 1889 that secretions from these cells may be what lowers blood glucose. So simply mincing a pancreas and giving the extract to diabetic dogs would not lower blood sugar because digestive enzymes secreted by the pancreas, also known as the external secretions of the pancreas, rendered the internal secretion useless. The challenge was to isolate that internal secretion from the islets of Langerhans without the harmful digestive enzymes from the rest of the pancreas.
During this time, Dr. Frederick M. Allen succeeded in prolonging the lives of diabetic patients by months to years with his starvation treatment, though some predictably starved to death. This was the established treatment for type 1, or juvenile diabetes, while scientists raced to find the elusive internal secretion, insulin.
Dr. Frederick Banting, a penniless veteran of World War I and aspiring orthopedic surgeon, was struggling to get by as a general practitioner in London, Canada, when he happened to read a paper in Surgery, Gynecology and Obstetrics about the islets of Langerhans. He had recently broken off his engagement with his fiancée of 4 years and was still trying to get his general practice off the ground. He woke up and scribbled down an idea that would change the lives of diabetic patients forever.
Diabetes. Ligate pancreatic ducts of dog. Keep dogs alive till acini degenerate, leaving islets. Try to isolate the internal secretion of these to relieve glycosuria.
How it might have been to have diabetes without insulin, it's hard for me to get my mind around. You read about some people who had it, and there was no way they could keep themselves living for a reasonable length of time. Certainly not the 57 years that I've had.
Treating type 1 diabetes without insulin would be, unfortunately, virtually impossible. So before there was insulin, type 1 diabetes, in either a slow or very rapid fashion, was a uniformly fatal disease.
At the time that Frederick Banting woke up with his idea, the Allen treatment for diabetes consisted of 3 steps: starvation to allow the patient to become sugar-free, increasing the diet gradually to find the patient's tolerance in calories consumed and sugar recorded in the urine, and the stationary stage to maintain those calories. If the patient's urine sugar testing did not stabilize, they started over from step 1. During the starvation phase, patients were often only allowed black coffee mixed with whiskey. In determining the patient's tolerance, most of the diabetic patient's diet consisted of thrice boiled vegetables to remove all excess carbohydrates.
In November of 1920, Banting took his idea to Dr. J.J.R. MacLeod, head of the physiology department at the University of Toronto. MacLeod was the leading authority on carbohydrate metabolism in Canada and had been investigating ways to isolate insulin from fish pancreases. Banting started working in MacLeod's lab on May 15, 1921. MacLeod assigned Charles Best, a graduate student at the university, to be Banting's assistant.
MacLeod allowed Banting just 10 dogs in a rudimentary lab connected to a kennel, despite some misgivings that Banting had not conducted a thorough literature review, had no experience treating diabetic patients, and was not familiar with surgery on the pancreas. He had Banting and Best read some of the leading papers and books on the subject before starting.
He wasn't a trained scientist in any way. He was a surgeon who just had an idea. But decided to give up his practice, pursue that idea. And it turned out that his intuition was great and it was successful in a very short period of time.
Banting's experiment began with ligating the pancreatic ducts of 5 dogs. After a few weeks, he hypothesized their pancreases would no longer secrete digestive enzymes as the digestive tissue degenerated, but they would still secrete the internal secretion, insulin. The atrophied pancreas would then be removed. He would then inject this extract into diabetic dogs whose whole pancreases had been removed to see if it would help keep them alive.
Banting and Best were conducting their experiments in poor working conditions, so the first few trials were unsuccessful. The lab was unclean, and Banting and Best were working in Toronto's summer heat. Many dogs died of infection due to the non-sterile conditions in which Banting was forced to do surgery. In addition, their first attempts at ligation were incomplete and failed, leading to the inevitable deaths of some of the depancreatized diabetic dogs waiting for the life-giving extract.
So MacLeod refused most of Banting's requests to improve working conditions, which is where we started to see some animosity growing between them. Banting and Best were forced to buy dogs from local kennels and to take dogs off the street to continue their experiments because so many were dying from infection. To add insult to injury, Dr. MacLeod was off visiting family in Scotland with his wife for most of the summer that Banting was working in his lab and was unavailable to provide counsel to the struggling researchers.
Early on in the experiment, in a fit of rage over the uncleanliness of the lab, Banting shouted at Best to clean the place from the top to the bottom or to leave. Best stayed all night cleaning all of their equipment and scrubbing the floor and lab benches, and the next morning neither of them mentioned the encounter. However, from then on, Best was Banting's assistant of choice and was a core contributor to his decision-making process. By November 1921, Banting began using fetal calves to produce the insulin extract he needed. He remembered from his childhood that fetal calves do not produce digestive enzymes before they are born, so he deduced that their pancreases would only be producing insulin. He also knew most cattle farmers make their cows pregnant before the slaughter to fatten them, so he and Best visited a local slaughterhouse to harvest 9 fetal calves' pancreases. After making extract from these pancreases, Banting's experiment began to show that these fetal calves' internal secretions reduced blood glucose consistently in the diabetic dogs. For the first time, MacLeod was impressed with Banting's progress.
MacLeod, Banting, and Best presented this work for the first time at the Journal Club of the University of Toronto Department of Physiology on November 14, 1921. Banting asked MacLeod whether they could include his name on the paper to gain credibility among the leading diabetologists in the conference, and he agreed. However, MacLeod ended up explaining most of the experiments during his introduction of Banting, leaving Banting with very little to say, which alienated him even more.
Banting got very attached to a couple of the diabetic dogs he worked with, often renaming them if they lived longer than anticipated. He was able to keep one dog, Marjorie, alive for 70 days with his extract.
Dr. James Bertrand Collop joined the team in December 1921 to help speed up the insulin purification process. On January 11th, 14-year-old and 60-pound Leonard Thompson was the first human to be injected with Banting and Best's extract, not Collop's. The first trial was inconclusive and he suffered a severe allergic reaction to the impure serum.
Collop improved on the purification process, but for some reason refused to share his procedures with his colleagues. In a furious outburst at Collop's unwillingness to cooperate, Banting actually threw Collop on the ground and bellowed, "So you will call this Collop's serum, will you?" which further split the team apart. Despite
all this infighting among the researchers, the science still managed to make its way forward. Collop's extract worked very well for Leonard Thompson. On January 23rd, a second trial using the insulin Collop had isolated resulted in Thompson's blood sugar dropping dramatically within hours. Newspapers raved about the miraculous discovery.
The team presented a paper about their recent findings, the effect produced on diabetes by extract of pancreas, to the Association of American Physicians on May 3, 1922. After MacLeod finished speaking, the room erupted with thunderous applause and a standing ovation.
In August, Banting began treating Elizabeth Hughes, the daughter of Charles Evans Hughes, the American Secretary of State. She was almost 15 years old, 5 feet tall, and weighed only 45 pounds. After only 2 weeks of treatment, however, she went from an 889-calorie diet to a 2,200-calorie diet.
On October 25, 1923, Banting and MacLeod jointly received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Upon hearing about the award, Banting was furious that MacLeod was included but Best was not.
Charlie Best was actually doing a guest lecture at Harvard Medical School for Dr. Elliot Joslin, a very well-known diabetologist, when Banting heard the news of the Nobel Prize. He immediately sent a telegram off to Dr. Joslin, which Joslin read with Best on the dais in front of the whole class.
I ascribe to Best equal share in discovery. Stop. Hurt that he is not so acknowledged by Nobel trustee. Stop. Will share with him. Banting.
Frederick Banting, there are a lot of, I think, very good things that he did in addition to discovering insulin. I think one of the things that I found most heartwarming about it was that when he and Best first finished their successful experiments, there were people around the world who got quite excited about this because there was no treatment for individuals with type 1 diabetes. There had been a number of false starts before, but there was no effective treatment. There was no issue of patenting or royalties or anything like that. And that sort of sharing, I think, is what science is and should be about. And as a result of that, it led, within a period of a year or a year and a half, to insulin being manufactured in many places around the world, which was hugely helpful to these people, mostly children at the time, who otherwise were just dying.
At that point, MacLeod felt pressured to include Collett, so he split his share of the Nobel Prize money with him. At 32, Frederick Banting remains the youngest recipient of the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. J.J.R. MacLeod left Toronto in 1928 to become a Regius Professor at the University of Aberdeen. He died in 1935 at the age of 59. Charles Best succeeded MacLeod as Professor of Physiology at the University of Toronto at the age of 29. Though Banting did become good friends with Collett, his friendship with Best eventually soured. Best continued to do more insulin research at Toronto, in addition to also researching choline and heparin. He died in 1978. Though Banting's future research endeavors were unsuccessful, his discovery of insulin has positively impacted millions of children and adults all over the world. He died in 1941 in a plane crash en route to England to join the war effort at the age of 49.
It's like a medical condition or health condition that you just have to keep treating all of your life. And it's not something that you, at least so far, can cure. But I find that it doesn't really burden my life very much.
Leonard Thompson, the first patient to receive insulin, lived close to a normal life, even though his diabetes was not always well controlled. He took 85 daily units of insulin. He died at the age of 27 of pneumonia.
One young boy, Teddy Ryder, who was diagnosed with diabetes at the age of 4, came to Banting for his first insulin injection a year later when he weighed only 27 pounds. In letters in the years to follow, he happily described himself as a fat boy now to his doctors. He became the first person to survive for 70 years on insulin and died at 76 years of age. He left some of his estate to the University of Toronto for medical research as thanks.
Elizabeth Hughes fully recovered and lived a normal life. She graduated from Barnard College in 1929 and married William T. Gossett a year later. She kept her diabetes and daily insulin injections a secret from almost everyone. Gossett didn't learn about it until a week after they became engaged. The couple had 3 children. Elizabeth died at age 73 from a heart attack. In the 58 years since she received insulin for the first time, she took 43,000 injections of insulin.
I have several patients that I've followed for a while who've been on insulin for more than 60 years. So it's clearly been life-saving and preserving. Some of them are quite healthy, and they'll outlive me. So it's good to see.